See you later, Dobby! Harry shouted, and he sprinted along the corridor and down the stairs, 3 at a time. 3 at a time. The entrance hall contained a few last-minute stragglers, all leaving the great hall after breakfast and heading through the double oak doors to watch the second task. They stared as Harry flashed past, sending Cullen and Dennis Creevey flying as he leapt down the stone steps and out into the bright, chilly grounds. As he pounded down the lawn, he saw that the seats that had encircled the dragon's enclosure in November were now ranged along the opposite bank, rising in stands that were packed to the bursting point and reflected in the lake below. The excited babble of the crowd echoed strangely across the water as Harry ran flat out around the other side of the lake toward the judges, who were sitting at another gold-draped table at the water's edge. Cedric, Fleur, and Crumb were beside the judges' table, watching Harry sprint toward them. "I'm here," Harry panted, skidding to a halt in the mud and accidentally splattering Fleur's robes. "Where have you been?" said a bossy, disapproving voice. "The task's about to start." Harry looked around. Percy Weasley was sitting at the judges' table. Mr. Crouch had failed to turn up again. Now, Percy," said Ludo Bagman, who was looking intensely relieved to see Harry. "Let him catch his breath." Dumbledore smiled at Harry, but Karkaroff and Madame Maxime didn't look at all pleased to see him. It was obvious from the looks on their faces that they had thought he wasn't going to turn up. Harry bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. He had a stitch in his side that felt as though he had a knife between his ribs, and there was no time to get rid of it. Ludo Bagman was now moving among the champions, spacing them along the bank at intervals of 10 feet. Harry was on the very end of the line, next to Crumb, who was wearing swimming trunks and was holding his wand ready. "All right, Harry." "Oh, sorry," Bagman whispered. "All right, Harry," Bagman whispered as he moved Harry a few feet further away from Crumb. "Now, what are you going to do?" "Oh, goodness gracious." "Know what you're going to do?" "Yeah," Harry panted, massaging his ribs. Bagman gave Harry's shoulder a quick squeeze and returned to the judges' table. He pointed his wand at his throat, as he had done at the World Cup, and said, "Sonorous!" And his voice boomed out across the dark water toward the stands. "Well, our champions are ready for the second task, which will start on my whistle. They have precisely an hour to recover what has been taken from them. On the count of 3, then. 1, 2, 3. The whistle echoed shrilly in the cold, still air. The stands erupted with cheers and applause. Without looking to see what the other champions were doing, Harry pulled off his shoes and socks, pulled the handful of gillyweed out of his pocket, stuffed it into his mouth, and waded out into the lake. It was so cold he felt the skin on his legs searing as though this were fire and not icy water. You ever felt something so cold it felt like it was burning you? I have. His sodden robes weighted down as he walked in deeper. Now the water was over his knees. and his rapidly numbing feet were slipping over the silt and flat, slimy stones. He was chewing the gillyweed hard and as fast as he could. It felt unpleasantly slimy and rubbery, like octopus tentacles. Where did it go? Okay, waist deep in the freezing water, he stopped, swallowed, and waited for something to happen. He could hear laughter in the crowd and knew he must look stupid, walking into the lake without showing any sign of magical power. The part of him that was still dry was covered in goose pimples. Half immersed in the icy water, a cruel breeze lifting his hair, Harry started to shiver violently. He avoided looking at the stands, and the laughter was becoming louder, and there were catcalls and jeering from the Slytherins. Then, quite suddenly, Harry felt as though an invisible pillow had been pressed over his mouth and nose. He tried to draw breath, but it made his head spin. His lungs were empty, and he suddenly felt a piercing pain on either side of his neck. Harry clapped his hands around his throat and felt two large slits just below his ears, flapping in the cold air. He had gills! Without pausing to think, he did the only thing that made sense. He flung himself forward into the water. The first gulp of icy lake water felt like the breath of life. His head had stopped spinning. He took another great gulp of water and felt it pass smoothly through his gills, sending oxygen back to his brain. He stretched out his hands in front of him and stared at them. They looked green and ghostly under the water, and they had become webbed. He twisted around and looked at his bare feet, and they had become elongated, and the toes were webbed too. It looked as though he had sprouted flippers. The water didn't feel icy anymore either. On the contrary, he felt pleasantly cool and very light. Harry struck out once more, marveling at how far and fast his flipper-like feet propelled him through the water, and noticing how clearly he could see, and how he no longer seemed to need to blink. He had soon swum so far into the lake that he could no longer see the bottom. He flipped over and dived into the depths. We should stop there. Kidding! Silence pressed upon his ears as he soared over the strange, dark, foggy landscape. He could only see 10 feet in front of him, so that as he sped through the water, new scenes seemed to loom suddenly out of the oncoming darkness. Forests of rippling, tangled black weed, wide plains of mud littered with dull, glimmering stones. He swam deeper and deeper, out toward the middle of the lake, his eyes wide, staring through the eerie, gray-lit water around him to the shadows beyond, where the water became opaque. Small fish flickered past him like silver darts. Once or twice he thought he saw something larger moving ahead of him, but when he got nearer he discovered it to be nothing but a large blackened log, or a dense clump of weed. There was no sign of any of the other champions, merpeople, Ron, nor, thankfully, the giant squid. Light green weed stretched ahead of him as far as he could see. 2 feet deep, like a meadow of overgrown grass. Harry was staring unblinkingly ahead of him, trying to discern shapes through the gloom, and then, without warning, something grabbed hold of his ankle. Harry twisted his body around and saw a Grindylow, a small horned water demon, poking out of the weed. Its long fingers clutched tightly around Harry's leg, its pointed fangs bared. Harry stuck his webbed hand quickly inside his robes and fumbled. Oh, I gotta turn the page. And fumbled for his wand. By the time he had grasped it, two more Grindylows had risen out of the weed and seized handfuls of Harry's robes and were attempting to drag him down. "Relatio!" Harry shouted. Except that no sound came out. A large bubble issued from his mouth, and his wand, instead of sending sparks at the Grindylows, pelted them with what seemed to be a jet of boiling water. For where it struck them, angry red patches appeared on their green skin. Harry pulled his ankle out of the Grindylows' grip and swam as fast as he could, occasionally sending more jets of hot water over his shoulder at random. Every now and then he felt one of the Grindylows snatch at his foot again, and he kicked it hard. Finally, he felt his foot connect with a horned skull, and looking back, saw the dazed Grindylow floating away cross-eyed, while its fellows shook their fists at Harry and sank back into the weed. Harry slowed down a little, slipped his wand back inside his robes, and looked around, listening again. He turned half-circle in the water, the silence pressing harder than ever against his eardrums. He knew he must be even deeper in the lake now, but nothing was moving but the rippling weed. "How are you getting on?" Harry thought he was having a heart attack. He whipped around and saw Moaning Myrtle floating hazily in front of him, gazing at him through her thick, pearly glasses. "Myrtle!" Harry tried to shout, but once again nothing came out of his mouth but a very large bubble. Moaning Myrtle actually giggled. "You want to try over there," she said, pointing. "I won't come with you. I don't like them much. They always chase me when I get too close." Harry gave her the thumbs up to show his thanks and set off once more, careful to swim a bit higher over the weed to avoid the Grindylows that might be lurking there. Oh my goodness gracious, 13 minutes? Ay, ay, ay. Okay, we have to stop. This is abrupt.